Dear friends, as the director of the Gennadios Library, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's final installment of our 2023-2024 Thalia Potamianos lecture series featuring Professor Emily Wilson. Emily's 3 talks examine the themes of heroic greatness, destiny, and wisdom in the Homeric poems and other works of ancient Greek literature. Tonight, she will focus on the wisdom of stories. This significant lecture series is the result of a visionary initiative by Mr. Potamianos, an overseer of the Gennadios Library. The lectures explore the widespread impact of Greek culture through the ages. These are the very ideals of Ioannis Gennadios, the founder of the Gennadios Library. Mr. Potamianos, Fokion, named the series in memory of his grandmother, a distinguished Greek doctor, academic, and philanthropist who came to Greece from Asia Minor in 1922. Marked by her experience as a refugee, Thalia Potamianos defined her life by her philanthropic actions dedicated to the public good and public service. We are honored to remember her and eternally grateful to Fokion for his leadership and generosity. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you my intellectual and professional home, the Gennadios Library at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Built in 1926 to house the unique collection of Ioannis Gennadios, ambassador of Greece in London, its rare books and archives have provided scholars with critical material to study the legacy and impact of Greek culture to the world of the Mediterranean and beyond, in Europe, Asia, and North Africa from the end of antiquity to our times. With 150,000 books, 1/3 of them dating to before 1900, the library has been for 100 years a fountain of knowledge for scholars from Athens and the world over. Every day, fellows make discoveries in rare journals, brittle pamphlets, colorful historical maps, beautiful books, or early manuscripts to tease out new meanings and novel interpretations. Indeed, preserving and enriching the collections for new generations is a crucial task for us. Equally rewarding are public lectures, exhibitions, concerts, and publications, as they allow us to share this erudition with a wider public in person and online. When you are in Athens, drop in for unique experiences. See an exhibit that explores the phenomenal relief aid that the United States offered to Greece in 1923 to deal with an unprecedented refugee crisis following the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. Or discover how, a century ago, an old neighborhood in Athens disappeared to give way to the glorious excavations of the ancient Agora of Athens, the birthplace of democracy. The most precious treasure in the Gennadios Library is the first printed edition of Homer in 1488 Florence, a true jewel that you can admire now online if you visit our website. It is thus fitting that this year's Potamianos lectures bring to us the delights and wonders of the most read Greek author, Homer, through the interpretation of a feisty and daring classicist, Emily Wilson. I'd like to thank her and the architect of this lecture series, Fokion Potamianos, for offering the Gennadios Library the opportunity to open a rigorous dialogue about the Homeric texts then and now. To introduce Professor Wilson, we have invited Mary Norris, author, Phil Hellin, and former longtime copy editor at The New Yorker. Mary has written for The Talk of the Town and NewYorker.com and published 2 books. The New York Times bestseller, Between You and Me, Confessions of a Coma Queen, in 2015, which was a finalist for the Thurber Prize for American Humor, and Greek to Me, 2019, which weaves her studies in modern and ancient Greek with travel, mythology, and personal history. It is now my pleasure to welcome Mary Norris to the podium.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to the American School, especially Nancy Savaidis and James Freeman, and most especially Thank you to Fokion and Lizanne Potamianos for inviting me here tonight. I first met Emily Wilson in Poughkeepsie in 2018 when she gave a talk at Vassar College. She was about to become internationally known for her celebrated translation of the Odyssey. She had been the subject of an article in the Times Sunday magazine, which focused on the many ways of translating Homeric epithets: swift-footed Achilles, silver-heeled Thetis. And the audience sympathized with her and appreciated her bravery and humor in the face of critics who, she joked, quibbled over her translation of that controversial word, the. That night, Professor Wilson's lecture focused on the episode in the Odyssey in which Telemachus punishes the maidservants who were disloyal to Odysseus. She focused on word choices, her own and others, and she brought a sensibility and precision to the text that resulted in a translation marked by arresting clarity and directness. She has since won a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Genius Award. That night, I joined the line to have her sign my book and saw another aspect of Emily Wilson. She was wearing a T-shirt with an owl on it, the emblem of Athena. I was writing a book about Greek at the time, and I was way over my head. Every fact or insight opened up into a trap under which was a sea of scholarship. I couldn't write about translation without reading Matthew Arnold, for instance. And I got sidetracked by the bizarre death of Milman Parry, the so-called Darwin of Homer scholars, who was killed when a gun went off in his luggage in a hotel room in Los Angeles. There was so much, there was too much. But somehow, knowing that Emily Wilson had worked under the aegis of Athena calmed me down. It inspired me, and it made me realize that I could only write what I could write. We see signs of Greek culture everywhere. Ads on trucks invoke the gods on every street corner. Phoenix Construction, Apollo Electric, Heracles, the smart choice in laundry. Poor Heracles. But the real everyday living thing we have in common with the Greeks is nature, human nature and the natural world. We see this especially in the Homeric simile. In her introduction to the Iliad, Emily Wilson points out that these extended similes allow the narrative to include domestic activities in peacetime, vivid descriptions of animal behavior, and thrilling evocations of the snow, storms, and winds. As snow falls thickly in a winter storm, when Zeus creates a blizzard, as when a deadly fire attacks a forest, wind spirals through and blazes everywhere. Such timeless passages bind together the stories within the story, and they connect us with Homer's audience throughout the ages. I don't know if among all the nature references in Homer, there is mention of the owl, to get back to the inspirational T-shirt, as when an owl hoots upon the city wall. But in recent years, an actual owl has been providing hope and solace to New Yorkers. In the first winter of the pandemic, a northern saw-whet owl stowed away on the giant spruce tree bound for Rockefeller Center. She was saved and released in the woods upstate. More recently, a Eurasian eagle owl, the late Flacco, who escaped from his enclosure at the Central Park Zoo, charmed New Yorkers and flourished for a while in the city, an emblem of freedom and independence, and also maybe of loneliness, hooting for a mate in the wilds of the Upper West Side. Nature unites us in sympathy, creating a sense of awe and gratitude. And surely this is something that we share with the ancients. Emily Wilson fosters that as she translates these epic stories from Homeric times to our times. Please join me in welcoming Emily Wilson.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much to Phokion for the opportunity to give these lectures. It's been a real honor, and thank you to the American School at Athens and the Gennadios Library. It's wonderful to have had this chance to celebrate Greek culture and antiquity with all of you. And if you're interested in these talks from this year, please make sure you stay tuned for the talks that will be happening next year as well. This series of lectures will continue with other people, and many more distinguished speakers will be talking over the years. In my trio of lectures, let me see if I can work out how to do this. I've been aiming to explore three central themes in the Iliad and Greek antiquity and its later receptions: heroism, fate, and storytelling. I've suggested that a close reading of the Iliad suggests a huge gap between the concepts and values that contemporary people want to project back onto Greek antiquity and those that we may find in the Greek texts themselves. Today I'm going to talk about the idea that certain stories, especially canonical, exemplary, or mythical stories from the past, provide moral or political education. There will be 5 sections of the talk. Your heart may sink, but they're all very short, so it's not going to go on for hours and hours. Each of the sections will be extremely short, and there will be time for questions. So I'll start off with a brief overview about the dangers and attractions of stories. Then I'll talk about multiplicity in the related myths of Helen and Pandora. Then I'll talk about check which order things are coming in. And then I'll talk about Achilles as a difficult or maybe unteachable student and his developing relationship with stories and storytelling over the course of the Iliad. Then I'll open up to talk a little bit about the reception of my work, which I think is illustrative of some interesting wider things about contemporary reception of Greek antiquity. And I'll end with a reading from the very end of the Iliad. Okay, so I will start with a story. The story is not from Homer, it's the story of Aesop and the Donkeys, translated by Laura Gibbs. They say that during an assembly at Athens, Demosthenes was prevented from making his speech. So he told the audience he just wanted to say a few words. When the audience had fallen silent, Demosthenes began his tale. It was summertime, and a young man had hired a donkey to take him from Athens to Megara. At midday, when the sun was blazing hot, the young man and the donkey's driver both wanted to sit in the donkey's shadow. They began to jostle one another, fighting for the spot in the shade. The driver maintained that the man had rented the donkey, but not his shadow, while the young man claimed he'd rented both the donkey and all the rights there too, including the shadow. Having told this much of the story, Demosthenes turned his back on the audience and began to walk away. The Athenians shouted at him to stop and begged him to finish the story. Indeed, said Demosthenes, you want to hear all about the donkey's shadow, but you refuse to pay attention when somebody talks to you about serious matters. So I think it's a good story, and it's a good double story. The term donkey's shadow was used in antiquity to describe a trivial subject. Like many of the fables in the Greek Aesopic tradition, the inset story, the one about the argument about who gets to sit in the not great air conditioning of the donkey, it's a story about class and power, as so much of the Aesopic tradition is. It could be told in a couple of different ways, either to skewer the rich young man who thinks money can even buy shadows, as well as labor, or it could point to the subjection of the driver and the donkey, who are owned entirely, at least for a little while, by their purchaser. But the frame story about the frustrated orator trying to get people to pay attention to something that's not about donkeys points to the way that traditional stories can be transformed depending on how you tell them and what kind of context you tell them in. In this context, the story is made into something not about ownership or about power, but about distraction and desire. It points to questions about storytelling. Is the purpose of stories to instruct or to delight? Fables, poetry, stories, especially the Homeric poems, as well as drama and lyric, played an essential role in ancient Greek paideia, the cultural and civic education of young male citizens. But there was also a constant running anxiety running through Greek antiquity about whether stories might also corrupt their audiences or seduce us away from more important activities. Many of the critiques of story from Greek antiquity have to do with its potential for falsehood and its dangerously intense emotional effects. Plato famously represents Socrates refusing to allow the philosopher rulers of his imaginary semi-ideal republic to read Homer or tragedy, because those stories, those poems, invite us to identify and empathize with all kinds of undesirables. They stir up dangerous emotions. They provide bad role models, like Achilles wallowing around in rage and grief. They provide vivid representations also of people and events that never actually existed. So it's all lies. And yet, Plato himself composed brilliantly evocative myths and stories, the myth of the cave. Aristotle's Poetics offers an implicit rebuttal of his teacher's critique, suggesting that fictional plots, at least in their best form, might provide a positive kind of ethical or emotional training. This ancient philosophical debate finds a partial parallel in an upsurge of contemporary discussion about the values and dangers of narrative. In contemporary psychology, medicine, politics, philosophy, journalism, historiography, even in advertising and branding, story is a sort of buzzword that's taken off over the last 10 or 20 years. Narratological terms that were once fairly abstruse, like point of view, POV, is now on every TikToker's lips. Is all this focus on story a good thing? Can immersion in stories or literature, as Martha Nussbaum argued, turn you into a better, more empathetic person, precisely through doing what Plato worried about, making us empathize with people who aren't like us? Or is Stanley Fish right to say that anyone who believes immersion in great literature makes you a better person has surely not spent much time in the sniping and gossip of academic literature departments? I'm not going to answer those questions now, but I'll come back to those themes a little bit later in the talk. Amid all this surge of contemporary interest in storytelling, there's also some contemporary backlash against the complexities and diversities of modern narratives. Ancient literature is sometimes imagined to provide an alternative with easily accessible, simple lessons, a straightforward kind of self-help with an impressively authoritative set of credentials. A nostalgic vision of ancient stories as simpler and more obviously morally instructive than modern ones is often intertwined with a specifically modern form of exclusionary ideology and fantasy, a point to which I'll return in the fourth part of the talk. The notion of ancient wisdom often relies on the idea of fixed stories and nuggets of wisdom preserved in ancient texts. But this doesn't really map at all well onto the earliest period of storytelling in written texts from archaic Greece that we have, which emerged from a primarily oral culture in which stories are constantly being retold in different ways for different performance contexts. We can see an example of the different performance contexts even in the story I just read of Demosthenes re-spinning an Aesopic fable for a different context. Orality and the specific social structures of archaic society, I suggested in the second lecture, make a huge difference for Homeric ways of thinking about fate and destiny. Orality also makes a difference for archaic Greek ways of understanding and experiencing narrative. As an example of this, let's look at how two intertwined and parallel myths, or maybe two versions of the same myth, it's hard to individuate myth, are told differently in the Hesiodic and Homeric poems, the stories of Pandora and of Helen. These stories are parallel in that they're both myths about how Zeus imposed suffering on mortal men by engineering the manufacture or birth of a particularly desirable woman who brings pain or death into the world and all our woe. There are three big similarities between these two figures. In both cases, there's a magical woman who's a divine solution to the problem that humans could be getting too powerful, or there were too many of them. In the Pandora myth, it's a divine response to the Promethean theft of fire, while in the myth of Helen, as we're told in non-Homeric sources, Zeus was responding to the complaints of Gaia, the earth, who felt that men were weighing her down too heavily. So Zeus responded by arranging for the birth of Helen and Achilles, which would inevitably result in first the Theban and then the Trojan War, which would wipe out a good large number of men. So problem solved. Both of them have a weird and inhuman origin story. Helen born from an egg, Pandora created out of a mix of body parts. Both of these figures are explicitly said in the ancient sources to be dog-like. In Works and Days, Zeus tells Hermes to give Pandora a dog-like mind. Helen, in the Homeric poems, describes herself as a dog or having a dog face or dog eyes. But each of the four archaic poems that includes versions of this core story uses it in importantly different ways. In the Theogony, the manufacturer of Pandora is enough in itself or in herself to bring suffering for men, because women will forever after reduce the prosperity of men's households. In Works and Days, Pandora isn't evil in herself, she brings evil into the world by opening the forbidden jar, the pithos, which lets out trouble and suffering, leaving only hope behind. Both of those stories, you might think, are obviously misogynistic, but perhaps surprisingly, in both cases, the narrator draws a lesson that isn't about how awful women are, but about human subjection to divine will, suggesting a tension about whether it's women or gods that are really the cause of men's suffering. A story that's on one level the same can be told to mean several different things. The Hesiodic and Homeric poems are from the same culture, draw on the same traditions, are composed in the same meter, and are constantly illuminating to read or hear against each other and together. There's a partial parallel between Pandora's ability to open the terrible jar and Helen's ability to open or reveal the identity of male warriors. But unlike in the way that the Pandora story is told in Hesiod, in how the Helen story is told in Homer, Helen gets to speak for herself. The Homeric Helen is characterized by her extraordinary perceptiveness and cleverness, ability to see through disguises, and her capacity to narrate her own story within the larger story of the war fought in her name. So now we're going to look just a little bit more closely at just one moment when Helen speaks, so we can see the complexity of her relationship to storytelling in general and her own story in particular. This is a moment from Iliad Book 6, where the Trojan warrior, Hector, bids what we and kind of he also know will be his last farewell to his family in the city, where he's insisting on going back to the battlefield, even though it may mean his death. He says goodbye to his parents, his wife, all of whom beg him not to go, and also to his brother Paris, along with Paris's newish, as of 9 years, wife, Helen. Helen, surprisingly, seems to have a close relationship with Hector and addresses him. Daeremo kunos kakomekunu okro SS. Alaganu neseltha kaihestio to depidifro da episa malista ponos franos amphibabeken heneke meo kunos kai Alexandru hanakatas. Hoisinepisius theka con moron, hus caiopiso, anthropoisipalometha oidamoi es somanoisi. This is a fraught encounter. We might expect Helen would be uncomfortable talking to Hector, given his forthright criticism of Paris over the affair that precipitated the war. But she disarms potential criticism by acknowledging the negative reaction she evokes from other people. She describes herself with a series of importantly ambivalent epithets, each of which echoes the terms in which Hesiod described Pandora. She twice labels herself as a dog, kunos, kuon. So dog is the first of the three. There's dog, there's bad plani, kakomerkonos, and she arouses shudders or chills, okro eser. This passage and those epithets have been much discussed, with scholars exercised about the degree to which Helen is actually blaming herself for the whole Trojan War, or using a performance of self-blame to deflect real criticism. I would argue that some of these discussions have moved too fast towards asserting that Helen is definitely accusing herself of doing something bad. The language is very ambiguous. She applies these apparently negative terms towards herself in an oblique case in the genitive, calling Hector brother-in-law of Medog, which obviously you can't do in English. And as a translator, I wrestled a lot with whether I could say brother-in-law of Medog, but I don't think you can make it work as natural English. The way that she's constantly not saying explicitly, I am a dog, I think I am a dog, but rather using that epithet of herself in an oblique case, arguably suggests she's not saying, this is what I think, but maybe she's saying, this is what you think of me. I'm going to inhabit your perspective, Hector. Moreover, none of these three terms necessarily suggests that Helen herself made bad choices. The word kakomerkanos could suggest that she's prone to coming up with bad plans. It could also suggest she is a bad plan, just as Pandora is a bad plan. She's not a bad planner. Just as the word polytropos can suggest both that Odysseus himself goes on lots of twisty ways on his journey and inhabits many different disguises, but also twists and turns are placed upon him by circumstance and the gods. There's the same kind of ambiguity about Helen's kakomerkania. And then the final weird word, okrues, suggests she arouses chills in others. And it seems this word, which is very unusual in Homeric Greek, seems to be formed by influence from okries, jagged, applied to rocks used as weapons, which again leaves Helen's agency unclear, because jagged rocks don't usually throw themselves. Perhaps the most ambiguous of the three is the ostensibly simple word, dog, kuon, which Helen here applies to herself twice. So this is an ancient dog and also my own lovely dog, whom I've chosen a picture of her among the gravestones for reasons that will be clear in a second. Dog is used as an insult in archaic Greek poetry, including elsewhere in the Iliad, of men as well as of women. Achilles calls Agamemnon, you dog face, when he's insulting him. It clearly isn't a purely gendered thing. Connotations of the English word bitch in colloquial usage can suggest meanness or cruelty or subordination, or the word can be positive. It can be reclaimed to mean something like girl boss. But none of those connotations really overlap with those of the word kuon in archaic Greek, which generally has to do not with cruelty or power, but with how dogs fit into an archaic Greek household. Like women, dogs shared in men's food and home, and they're allies in certain elements of men's lives. They're allies in hunting, but they have different talents, different appetites. They don't follow the same social norms as most human men, at least. Of course, later, the Cynics modeled their behavior on dogs, the kunikoi, and thought it was best to give up on the social norms that say we shouldn't poop in the streets, and the Cynics thought we should do those things like dogs. Within the Iliad itself, we're introduced to dogs in the first line of the poem with the idea that dogs are the animals who will benefit the most if there's a massacre. They will feast on the dead bodies in the battlefield. Kunesita daita. When men's norms, like holding funerals for the dead, fail, the dogs are in good luck. Maybe Helen describes herself as a dog because she's different from those she lives with, whether she's in Troy or back in Sparta. And like other women, like dogs, she'll still be alive when all the men are dead. This difference could be seen as disturbing or negative. Humans don't usually want to be dog food. But it's not necessarily about the dogs being evil or doing anything wrong. The complexities and ambiguities of this passage are often tamped down, I would argue, in translation, at least in the translations I've looked at. In looking at a few different translations of this passage, many of them eliminate the dog metaphor entirely and make Helen unambiguously condemn herself for sinful actions, or very frequently, they make her condemn herself for lust or sexual misconduct, none of which is present in the Greek in any obvious way. You have to leap quite a long way away from what the text says. Moreover, in none of the translations I've looked at is there a possibility of bad planny Helen, bad strategy kakomekonos Helen being ambiguous, echoing the Pandora story, where she is herself the bad plan that's used as imposed on mortal men to kill them off, not rather than that she herself is willing and dealing to come up with a strategy. So we have this is the old prose translation by the novelist Samuel Butler, where she's abhorred and sinful. This is the Robert Fitzgerald translation, where she's a whore, nightmare of a woman, which of course are very different metaphors from the metaphors in the original. Fagles uses both bitch and whore. The Lombardo translation uses bitch and wanton, and also introduces the, I think, very different American cliche of frigidity, between calling her a cold-blooded woman. The Karen Alexander translation, which was the only published complete Iliad into English by a woman before mine, uses the much more literal dog, although it also suggests unambiguously that Helen calls herself evil thinking. So this is my translation, which I'm going to read. Sorry, I messed up how I have my arrangements. Then Helen spoke and tried to make him stay. Brother-in-law, I am a source of fear and source of evil strategy, a dog. You have endured the greatest pain and grief because of us, because of me, a dog, and Paris with his folly and delusion. Zeus set an evil lot upon us all to make us topics for a singer's tale, for people in the future still unborn. I wanted to leave the image of Helen calling herself a dog rather than interpret within the translation, though of course I have a lot of ideas about interpreting it, what it might mean. I think the reader should grapple for themselves with what does it mean that Helen describes herself as a dog. I also wanted to echo what I see as the original's ambiguities about bad plans and what exactly is she saying about the chills. Helen is associating herself with those as effects or things to do with her without exactly saying that she's caused them or she's to blame. In general, in my translations, I prioritize sound and form, so I use regular poetic meter when the original does, unlike many modern translations. And I try not to make the translation more opaque or clunkier than the original. If Homer's Greek is clear, my English should also be clear. But I also want to prioritize metaphor and semantic complexity, so I don't want to erase the metaphor of Helen as a dog, even when it might be difficult to figure out exactly what it means. Translating a dog as a dog might seem simpler on one level, but I think it actually results in a more complicated and more fascinatingly alien text. One final point about this passage is that Helen also uses a fourth and very unusual term to describe both herself and Paris, aioidemos, sung about, related to the noun aioider, meaning song or tale. It's a word that occurs only here in the whole of the Homeric poems. In other ancient literature, this word is positive in its register, and in the Iliad more broadly, male warriors constantly aspire to fame or kleos, the possibility of being celebrated in stories told by people in the future. So you might think there's a puzzle here. How can it be a bad lot or a bad destiny to be famous in song? The standard ancient Greek dictionary, Liddell and Scott, solves the problem by asserting, on the basis only of this one line, that here and only here, the word must be bad. It must mean notorious or infamous. But dictionaries, like translations, are created by humans whose interpretations may be debatable. I would argue there's no real reason to think the word means something totally different here than its other usages. Helen knows that she and Paris will, like Hector himself, be central characters in a storytelling poem tradition like the Iliad itself. She's aware that being the subject of immortal stories can be both good and bad. Maybe it's a neutral term. People cannot have all kinds of different reactions to the story and can tell it and translate it in many different ways. The subject of the story doesn't always get to control her own reception. And I think that's a lot of the point of how Homer presents Helen in both Homeric poems, is that she's trying to control her own narrative by telling it herself, but she's also aware that stories proliferate beyond any one teller's control. So now we're moving on to Achilles. Simone Weil famously claimed that the Iliad is a poem of force and argued that force, which of course within Weil's own era of totalitarianism was spreading all across Europe, was also the theme of Homer. It's perhaps even more obviously a poem of language. Language itself takes on a kind of force. Warriors on the battlefield often exchange both winged words and winged weapons, and destroy, influence, or honor each other by shame, injunction, or praise, which cause as much death as bronze piercing through flesh. Catalogues, similes, laments, proverbs, and insults all showcase the ways that language binds and divides people and how much power it has over us. Language itself is a character. In the third bit of the talk, I'm going to sketch out how the trajectory of Achilles' story in the Iliad, the story of his cataclysmic wrath, his menace, is framed through this character's changing relationship to storytelling and suggests something about what stories can and can't do to teach or change people. In Book 1, in the opening enraged quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, Achilles repeatedly tells and retells his own story in a variety of different moods and for a variety of purposes. He gives Agamemnon a furious recap of his own experience in the last 9 years, fighting for Agamemnon and getting almost nothing for his efforts. "I came with you, you brazen cheat, to please you, to claim back compensation from the Trojans for Menelaus and for you, you dog-face. But none of that means anything to you. My hands work hardest in the furious fighting, but when we share the spoils, you get much more." A different kind of autobiographical recap comes in Achilles' account of the wooden staff by which he swears in the Greek assembly. It's a stick cut from its roots in the forest, in the mountain, whose history of permanent amputation from where it grew, from its former home, hints that Achilles, who was of course raised in the mountains in the wilds by the centaur, is himself aware that he's been amputated and he will die at Troy. A different storytelling happens when, towards the end of Book 1, Achilles summarizes the whole story so far to his sea goddess mother, Thetis, to persuade her that she must restore his lost honor. What all these early stories from Achilles have in common is that they're all about him. They all center on the warrior himself as the hard-done-by sufferer, who's experienced terrible, upsetting, unfair, enraging kinds of loss. In this first phase of his overwhelming wrath, storytelling serves to lock him ever deeper into the cycle of self-pity, the rehearsal of old injuries, allowing him to weaponize those injuries in his verbal attacks on those who've wronged him, Agamemnon and all the Greeks, and in his cries and pleas for divine help in getting his deadly revenge. The Achilles we meet in Book 9 is, if anything, even angrier, but in a quieter way. He has a different relationship to storytelling. The Achilles who's staying home in his tent with Patroclus has apparently spent the time he wasn't on the battlefield singing to his lyre and telling the mythical stories of famous heroes, the Clea Andron. In other words, he's not telling stories only about himself. Some commentators have claimed that even at this moment, only a third of the way through the poem, Achilles is already managing to learn a lesson from his stories. Aelian, a Roman author from the 2nd century AD, claimed that, quote, "Achilles in the Iliad seems to me to put his rage to sleep when he sings along to a lyre and brings reminders to himself of the famous tales of former men through his songs." This is an interesting but I think dubious interpretation. The text tells us that Achilles is bringing himself pleasure, but the nature of the pleasure is not specified. Maybe he's comforted by the idea that other warriors in legend have been glorified properly, even if he isn't. Maybe it's a kind of promise that eventually he's going to get his. Or maybe, and I think this is maybe a lot more likely, it's pure distraction, like the donkey's shadow, but it doesn't actually mean that he's not still furious, which he is. And we can see that very clearly from how he reacts when his 3 visitors show up to try to persuade him to give up his wrath and come back to join the fight against the Trojans with the Greeks. Book 9 is the book in which 3 Greek warriors, along with 2 heralds, Odysseus, Achilles' old tutor Phoenix, and Ajax, come to try to persuade him that he should return at last to battle to save the Greeks from destruction by Hector, who's become more and more powerful in the absence of Achilles. The three speakers, the three ambassadors, try three different modes of persuasion. First, Odysseus gives a long speech listing all the lovely stuff that Achilles will get if he gives up on his wrath and comes back to fight. So all the bribes that Agamemnon has promised, which include not just giving back the original woman, Briseis, but a ton more women, a lot more tripods, and this whole long list of stuff. Achilles responds with a very famous, furious response about, "I hate like the gates of Hades, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart." And of course, it's a way of saying, "I hate you, Odysseus," as well as, I still hate Agamemnon. Phoenix tries to persuade, with the longest speech in this book, tries to persuade Achilles by means of mythical stories, Pleia Andron. And then Ajax, the final speaker, gives the shortest speech and tries to persuade him by means of citing what the social norms are. He tells him what he must already know, what's usual when there's a killing in a community, or what's usual when somebody loses something that really matters. If there's a terrible loss, as there has been in this case, not with an actual death, but with what Achilles perceives as a terrible slight to his honor. There are social mechanisms, even if it's a real death, for compensation payments to the victim's family. By refusing the gifts, Ajax conveys to Achilles, he's refusing to be part of the community. He's not adhering to the norms. Of the three speeches, I think it's interesting to see that the people who talk the most, Odysseus and Phoenix, both get nowhere. Achilles doesn't actually respond in any way that changes his plans in response to either of the two other speeches. Only Ajax seems to at least tweak Achilles' attitude about what his plans are. He promises to return to battle rather than storm off in the morning, although he also insists that he will only return if Hector reaches his own encampment and starts setting fire to the Myrmidon ships. Phoenix tells three different stories to Achilles, all trying to persuade him to give up on his rage against Agamemnon and the other Greeks and to return to fight with them. The first part of his speech is a sort of autobiographical story telling about how he took care of Achilles when he was little and dandled him on his knee and fed him wine and that they have a former relationship, and therefore he has a relationship that should mean that Achilles will trust him and do what he says. Then he tells the allegorical story about how deadly delusion, ater, can take hold of people's minds. We do stupid stuff, but then you say sorry. The wrinkled old prayers follow afterwards and mend the damage. And then, with his third story, he cites mythological precedent, telling the story of Meleager, a hero from times past, who was furious but gave up on his anger and came back to battle. Phoenix adapts each of these stories to fit the present. Phoenix, who himself may be a made-up story to fit the present occasion, makes several changes to the traditional story of Meleager, including giving Meleager a wife, Cleopatra, whose name is the inverse of Achilles' own quasi-wife, Patroclus. It's presented as an exemplary story about how a hero in the past relented from his anger belatedly, with the implication that Achilles should learn from the example of Meleager. The stories are different. The first is personal, the second allegorical, the third mythological. But the scene shows the absolute futility of any of them to try to change Achilles' mind. Poor old Phoenix is stuck with a student who seems to be unteachable. Achilles is friendly to him and invites him to stay the night, but he doesn't change his mind in response to all of these stories. One could say similar things about the depiction of stories in how the rambling old stories about the old days, which are given repeatedly by Nestor to the Greek council meeting, usually have almost no impact on what the people actually decide to do. As far as wrath is concerned, stories even the most carefully judged mythological exemplary stories, seem to be all donkey's shadows. So in terms of narrative, of the Iliad's own narrative, if Phoenix's long stories have no impact on the plot, Why does the poem include them? I'd say it's because stories and the possibility of being changed by stories are essential in the poem's vision of how people construct both action and memory. Stories may not work to transform human behavior in the ways we might hope or want them to do, especially if we're teachers who may be enticed by the fantasy that stories can make you a better person, and Phoenix obviously has that fantasy. Sadly, maybe doesn't work. And yet, stories do at least provide Achilles with a kind of social bond, a link to the people of the past, and the community of living people who tell those stories and keep retelling them for different contexts. That isn't nothing, and it ensures that Achilles, even in isolation from his larger community, remains at least partly connected to others, both in the present and in the past. In Book 24, so we're zooming very fast ahead through the Iliad, there's a very different relationship between Achilles and storytelling. The Trojan king, Priam, visits Achilles to beg him to give back the terribly mutilated body of his son Hector, whom Achilles killed, and even after death, won't stop humiliating and dragging around and trying to despoil. The figure of Phoenix lurks behind this encounter, and both Priam and Achilles are echoing the former role of Phoenix. A powerful simile compares the appearance of Priam to someone fleeing his homeland after a murder, a trope that echoes the autobiographies of both of Achilles' dearest companions, both Phoenix and Patroclus, both of whom came to live with Achilles because they'd killed members of their own communities. Priam, like Patroclus, like Phoenix, is conscious of his role as a stand-in for Achilles' old father, whom he'll never see again. Like Phoenix, like Patroclus, Priam tries to teach Achilles something about restraint and changing your mind. But Achilles is now himself also inhabiting the role that Phoenix had earlier inhabited, of being the storyteller. One could argue that one of the lessons here is that you only really learn something when you're ready to teach it yourself. Achilles relates to Priam two presumably traditional myths, both adapted, like the earlier story of Meleager, to fit the present context, both presented as teaching a lesson about emotional regulation. I've already talked about both these stories in my previous lectures, but I know that the audience may be different for the different ones, so I'll recap for those who weren't here. The first is the story of the two jars, or pithoi, of Zeus, storage jars like those in which grain was stored in antiquity, one of which contains good and one evil. Some humans get a mixture of the two, and some just get suffering. This story is a cousin to the story of Pandora, which also features the fatal Pithos from Hesiod. Both share this idea of the big storage jar set up by Zeus containing human suffering. Achilles' version removes the idea that a single human has caused the spread of suffering into the world, creates a very different kind of lesson, that suffering is in fact inevitable, even for those like himself or his father or Priam who have experienced good fortune in their lives. The second story that Achilles tells Priam is of Niobe, who boasted she had more children than Leto, mother of the twins, Apollo and Artemis. And in punishment for her pride, her boasting, those two gods killed all her children. The number of the children varies in different ancient accounts, but that's the outline, and we get a version of that told by Achilles. This myth was presumably traditional. We get it in different sources, but Achilles' version is again adapted to fit the present context. He tells it not primarily, or at least not only, as a story about pride and punishment or boasting and how you shouldn't boast too much, but primarily about grief and endurance. Niobe, like Priam, has lost many, many children, and she has also, like Achilles, caused the deaths of her own dearest loved ones by her own pride. Niobe, Achilles tells Priam, still had to eat despite her grief. He adds that Niobe was turned into a rock that weeps forever. As ancient commentators noted, these two details about Niobe's story are inconsistent. They're two stories wedged together that don't go. Rocks usually don't eat. This might be a symptom of two different versions of the oral tradition surviving in the text, as if the blue pencil has failed to go through the one that doesn't fit. But the contradiction is meaningful in that it points to the ways that life goes on even after terrible loss, and that terrible loss also goes on, like the loss of Hector for Priam or Patroclus for Achilles, and never goes away. the rock is always there, even if we're eating. Moreover, the figuration of Niobe as rock echoes the narrator's presentation of Priam bundled up like a statue in the dung at the start of book 24. Priam was earlier kind of like a statue or a rock. And we've also had a repeated image in books 2 and book 16 of Agamemnon's and Patroclus's tears flowing down the face like water down a black rock. These echoes suggest an ability on the part of Achilles to understand and inhabit suffering that he had previously dismissed and mocked. Achilles presents both these stories, of the jars and of Niobe, as instructional, intertwined with imperatives. Here's the story, so you, Priam, must do this. As with the pedagogy of poor old Phoenix, the poem does not present the stories of Achilles as actually changing Priam's mind or his behavior. Priam responds to the story of the two jars by staying on message, asking for his son's body back. He says nothing about Niobe, or nothing in response. When he eats, it's presumably because he's got his son's body back, as he wanted, rather than because Achilles went on about mythological stories. So again, if stories don't particularly work as teaching tools or means of persuasion, why does the poem include them? I think Achilles' willingness to take on the role of the storyteller as well as the role of the host, which he's doing in both book 23 as the host of the funeral games, and maybe even more extraordinarily in book 24 as the host of his military enemy, giving him food and entertaining him with stories, demonstrates a newfound perspective. Telling someone a new version of a traditional story is a way of inviting them into a worldview, a reminder of shared heritage. It creates a new shared world to inhabit together. In both narratives also, Achilles takes a traditional story and tells a doubled version of it. His jars are double compared to the single jar of Pandora. The grief of Niobe goes in two different, inconsistent ways, food and rock. In earlier instances of storytelling, as I suggested about book 1, Achilles insists that there's only one relevant story, and it's all about him, and the implications of it are very clear. He's insulted, he must be furious, he must get payback. The swift-footed hero is priding himself on the directness and straight-aheadness of both his words and his physical being. In this moment of the poem, in the final book, he's demonstrating that he's come closer to acknowledging complexity and multiplicity. There's suffering, there's also blessing. There's rocks, there's also food. There's infinite grief, and we're still going to have dinner. This sequence points to the possibility that stories may not work reliably as mechanisms to change behavior, but they can work to create community, to move beyond egotism into empathy, to nurture an awareness of the vast range of human experience, including recognition between people from very different cultures or different sides in a war. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the fourth part of the talk, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of studying ancient Greece in general and maybe a little bit about the humanities. And I'd like to get at that theme by looking at the silliest threads in the reception of my own work as a Homer translator, which I think are illustrative of some important features in contemporary reception of Greek antiquity more broadly. And maybe also Roman antiquity, which I know that's not the brief of these talks. So this slide is the only mention of Rome that there will be. All right, so I am grateful to have had a lot of lovely, serious reviews of my translations by colleagues. And I'm almost equally grateful to the various amazingly numerous trolls who've inveighed against my translations of Homer as if I were managing single-handedly to destroy Western civilization and the patriarchy. If only it were that easy to destroy them. In terms of my actual goals as a retranslator of Homer, there's not really anything particularly radical about what I'm doing. I choose to use very regular poetic meter. I care a lot about the original poems, and I do a lot of reading and rereading the originals. There would, of course, be no headline if the headline said, overeducated, poetry-loving professor who's been studying Homer for many decades labors to produce a traditional metrical translation of these 3,000-year-old poems that have already been translated numerous times into English already. That's not a headline, and I get why that was not the headline. It would not make it sound exciting or make you feel like you have to buy it. Whereas controversial woke feminist translations, I think that did a great deal that my publicists ought to be happy about. More seriously, I think it's fine if readers and anyone, including colleagues, but including people who don't read the originals, might dislike or disagree with any choice I make in my translations. It's also fine to prefer other translations for any number of aesthetic or interpretative or pedagogical reasons. But reasoned disagreement is, of course, not what's going on with the labeling of my translations as quote-unquote woke, a word which I think means almost nothing. It's not about me, it's about what I think are interesting forms of contemporary politicization of Greek antiquity. Those rely on perceptions about identity, which then get projected into ideas about my presumed identity and my presumed feelings, which are much more than about my work, which, of course, many of my most adamant critics haven't read. Many people who claim to love the Homeric poems seem to think it's disrespectful to present the characters as fully rounded, complicated human beings, as if the point of engaging with ancient literature were to force people to bow down before two-dimensional cardboard cutouts. I think a lot of the backlash had to do with the marketing of my Odyssey translation as the first into English by a woman, which made journalists fixate on my gender in ways that I think had nothing much to do with my actual work, and then prompted counter-reactions of very predictable kinds. I've been amazed by how many people were triggered by my use of the word complicated for Odysseus, which I think speaks to a fantasy of an idea of antiquity as anything but complicated. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the idea of ancient wise stories. They mustn't be complicated. They must be simple, and they must say exactly what we guessed they would say without having to read them. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this whole phenomenon, because I think it has a huge amount of traction, and beyond the specifics of me or my work, I think it's illuminating to see how those perceptions are bound up with specifically modern forms of misogyny and exclusion more broadly, which were a crucial form in the 18th and 19th century formations of the modern discipline of quote-unquote classics, which, as the name suggests, has to do with class exclusion, and which is still virulent among a strand of contemporary amateur enthusiasts. So there's this, I think, very ingrained and interesting set of ingrained modern ideas about the ancient world, and Homer in particular, none of which stands up to scrutiny, but all of which are very tenacious. The Homeric poems themselves, as I've argued in these lectures, are anything but simplistic in their representations of human and divine society, action, psychology, poetics, narrative. And yet there's this idea that they're supposed to be simple. They're supposed to provide a respite from the complexities of the modern world. There's an implicit idea also that back in the fantasy version of antiquity, white men were the only people who mattered, and therefore they're the only people who get to comment on them. A different, but I think very deeply related strand in all of this, both reception of me, but then culture much more broadly that isn't just about me, is this interesting resistance to the idea that Homer could be engaging and syntactically clear in English. Homeric syntax is not very difficult compared to other archaic and ancient Greek poetry, some of which is much harder than the Homeric poems are. My translations have sometimes been presented as modern, despite the use of traditional poetic form, which I think goes to an idea that if it's clear and engaging, that must be modern, because back in the day, everyone was very boring, and you could never understand them. For some readers, these poems are supposed to be foggy and mostly incomprehensible, even in translation. This is another strand in the idea that ancient literature should be exclusive, because, of course, fog helps keep people out, and should be used as a tool for social exclusion. Themes that, again, have played an essential part in classics as a discipline. You might think that people who aren't classicists wouldn't care very much about the field, and also wouldn't think it's their job to gatekeep it. But that's actually not the case, and I've been startled to see about the degree to which people who are not classicists think they have to police classics. This speaks to the cultural work ancient literature and ancient studies do in policing contemporary boundaries of class, race, and gender. So beyond the uses of classics to reinscribe systems of social exclusion, Many of the worst justifications for studying ancient Greek literature, or maybe humanities more broadly, have to do with a simplistic and usually wrong idea about how learning happens. In Plato's Symposium, Socrates comments to the tragic poet Agathon, whose work, tragically, we don't have, that it would be lovely if wisdom could just pass seamlessly from one person to another as they snuggle next to each other on a couch having a drink, by osmosis, like water through wool. Sadly, it doesn't work like that. Teaching and learning are really difficult because it doesn't work like that. Similarly, reading or listening to stories doesn't instantly, automatically ensure that you become a better person or that you absorb a particular prefab set of lessons from the stories. The story of Meleager doesn't make Achilles stop being angry. The stories of the Jars and Niobe don't instantly make the rage and grief of Achilles and Priam go away. And yet, nonetheless, stories matter. Current discussions, op-ed articles and general pieces, of which there have been huge numbers over the last decade, and I feel like there's a growing number of op-ed pieces about the state of the humanities, the state of classics, the future of literary studies, the English major, all that stuff. These pieces very often argue about whether these subjects are useful because they teach transferable skills that are also useful in professional fields, or because they teach particular kinds of useless knowledge or useful knowledge, or because serious critical engagement with any element of human culture is valuable in itself, or as a training in critical thinking, or some combination of those. Despite what many op-ed writers declare, we don't actually have to choose between them. All of those elements can be part of the value of any serious humanities education, including the study of Greek antiquity. I want to emphasize a couple of further points that I think are sometimes downplayed in the op-ed discourse. One is that it's not just about the individual student or listener or scholar or reader engaging with literature or other cultural objects. As I emphasized in my account of how Achilles' relationship with stories changes in the course of the Iliad, the world of stories is a place where people, even enemies, can meet and see each other. Stories, culture, humanities won't necessarily make you a better person or teach you how to live, but they provide insight and a kind of community, even with those who are long dead, and among those who are sharing the experience of the story and working out how to tell it this time. It's not just about passive absorption of wisdom from narrative or the projection of modern fantasies back onto antiquity. Stories come alive through active engagement and choices about how to interpret, how to translate, and whose stories to tell and how. Stories can be on one level the same. The stories of Pandora and Helen are very parallel, as I argued, in their tropes and themes. But their quote-unquote same story can become totally different in how it's told, in how it's translated, or the context in which it's put. The value of studying ancient Greek literature in a classroom or an intellectual community like the American School in Athens or the Gennadius Library is that these frameworks, these communities, provide a check on simplistic projections of one individual or one internet pothole projecting from the present to the past, allowing individuals to test out different possible ways of reading, telling, hearing, and interpreting the same story through hearing how it could be told by other speakers. Achilles is in a different emotional state once he's able to tell and engage with stories that aren't just about him, that don't just belong to him. He can speak to his enemy's experience as well as his own. So too, one of the most important values in studying antiquity is that it enables us to engage with people whose lives are very different and very distant from our own, to interrogate our own presuppositions by seeing what we might want to project back onto the past and the gaps between one story and another. I think that the backlash against my work is a very positive sign about the field of ancient Greek studies as a whole. It points to a public recognition that simplistic, false, exclusionary ways of framing the study of antiquity are recognized as being under threat, as they should be. It's an exciting moment in the field of ancient Greek studies because there's new energy among both scholars, students, and general readers towards interrogating the formation of the discipline and the possibilities of approaching ancient stories and societies in new ways. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by reading the end of the Iliad. And so just to contextualize it, so Priam gets his son's body back from Achilles, and Achilles promises that he'll give a humanitarian pause, the possibility of a pause in the fighting while the Trojans bury the body of Hector, brought home at last after death to Troy. This is a passage which has to do with memory, history, and honoring the dead. And it also points to the theme I've been emphasizing about the multiplicity of stories. We get not one lament for Hector, but three, which are all very, very different from one another. We have first the lament of Hector's wife, Andromache, who treats Hector's death as pure loss. She points to her own future enslavement and the imminent death of their baby, who's going to be hurled from the city walls. Hector's mother, Hecuba, by contrast, presents Hector's death as if it were pure gain. Her lament is framed almost as a delighted praise speech in the different archaic genre of praise poetry, celebrating her beautiful son who's achieved the ultimate good death. And in a way, she also echoes the deaths of Niobe's children, imagining that Hector could have been killed not by horrible old Achilles, but by Apollo. The final woman lamenting for Hector is a surprising one, Helen, who, of course, one can argue about whether she's a Trojan woman or a non-Trojan woman, treating Hector's death as a loss for her personally, characteristically putting herself at the center of the story, but also pointing to the way that Hector was able to reach out in kindness even to someone who should have been his enemy, just as Priam and Achilles have been able to find a kind of connection despite their enmity, at least for a little while. There's here an implicit gesture of grief, not just for Hector himself, but for the end of kindness. The city, after these laments are over, after this funeral is over, the fighting and killing will start again, the city will be sacked. There will be no more kindness. The children will be killed, the women will be led off in slavery. Helen's first world problems about being disliked will be the least of it. The inclusion of these three laments at the end of the poem points to the way that this poem, this story of war, rage, glory, and violence, includes within it also an intense focus on grief, reminding us that stories of grief, like all stories, come in many different forms. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the Greek, and then my translation, and then a tiny bit of the Greek again, and then I'd love to have questions from you guys. Tesin Andromache lukolonos ekego oio, Hectoros androphanoio keremete kersin ekusa. Anarabaionos neosuleo, cademe keren lepesin megaroisi, pais dedinebios autos, hontigomen sutego tetosum moroi, udeminoio heben hixes thai, prengar polis hede cadacras persetai, Egara lolas, episcopos, hostemin auten uruscu, eces delocas, kednas, kainepia tekna. White-armed Andromache among the women began the keening, cradling in her arms the head of murderous Hector. You died young, Hector, and left me in your house a widow. Your boy is still a little child, a son born from unlucky parents, you and me, and I do not believe he will grow up. Before that time, this town will be destroyed from top to bottom because you are dead, the one who guarded and watched over Troy and kept the wives and little children safe. In hollow ships, the women will be soon taken as slaves, and I along with them. And you, my child, will either come with me and do humiliating work, enslaved to some harsh overlord, or else a Greek will grab your arm and hurl you from the wall, a dreadful death, in anger because Hector had killed perhaps his brother, son, or father. Numerous Greeks were seized by Hector's hands and took the boundless earth between their teeth. Your father was not gentle in grim battle. Therefore the people in the city mourn him, and you piled grief and sorrow on your parents, Hector, and left me the worst pain of all. In death you did not reach your arms from bed to me, or leave me with some final words that I could have forever kept in mind while crying night and day. In tears she spoke. The women wailed in answer. Then among them, Hecuba sobbed and led the lamentation. Hector, by far the dearest to my heart of all my children, when you were alive, the gods loved you, and even in your death, they care for you. Swift-footed Lord Achilles enslaved and sold my other sons he captured in lands beyond the unrelenting sea. Samothrace, Imbros, and volcanic Lemnos. He took your life with his sharp bronze and dragged you despoiled around the tomb of his companion, Patroclus, whom you killed. But even so, he could not raise him back to life again. Now you lie here, at home, in dewy freshness, as if Apollo shot his silver bow and with his gentle arrows took your life. In tears she spoke and roused unending mourning. And Helen was the third to lead the women in lamentation, and she spoke among them. Hector, by far the dearest to my heart of all the brothers of my husband, Paris, the godlike man who brought me here to Troy. I wish that I had died before that day. It has been 20 years since I came here and left my fatherland, but all that time I never heard an insult or bad word from you. If any kinsfolk in the house spoke unkind words to me, my husband's sisters or brothers, or their wives in pretty dresses, or even my mother-in-law, my husband's father treated me like a daughter of his own. You talked them out of it, protecting me with your sweet kindness and your gentle words. So I am sick at heart with grief, and mourn for you and for my own bad luck. No other in spacious Troy was kind to me like you. All of them shudder in disgust at me. She spoke in tears. The countless crowd of people wailed in response. Old Priam told the Trojans, "Now gather wood and bring it to the city, and fear no ambush from the Greeks. Achilles promised me, when he let me go away from his back ships, that they will not attack us until the 12th dawn comes." At this they yoked oxen and mules to carts, and soon assembled in front of town, and for 9 days they gathered abundant wood. But when the 10th bright dawn brought light to mortals, they brought out brave Hector with tears and weeping, and they laid his body upon the towering pyre and lit the flames. When newborn dawn appeared with rosy fingers, the people gathered round the funeral pyre of famous Hector. Once they were assembled, they quenched the pyre with shining wine, wherever it smoldered. Then his brothers and companions, their faces soaked with tears, still sobbing hard, collected up his white bones, which they carried and laid inside a golden chest, and set soft purple cloths to cover them, and quickly lowered the chest into a fresh-dug grave, and heaped large stones on top set close together. Soon they piled high the mound, and round about it stood guards on every side, in case the Greeks attacked too soon with all their weaponry. After the mound was built, they went back home, then came together for a glorious banquet inside divine King Priam's house. And so they held a funeral for Horse Lord Hector. I was going to read those last 4 lines and then get ready with your questions. Cuentes detosema palinkion, auterapeta, ius unageira monoi dai nun tericudea daita, domus in empria moio diotra os basileos, hos soi gamphia ponta von Hectoros hippodamoio. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for your captivating lecture. We're going to take some questions now from Emily. Please raise your hand. We have 2 mics that we'll pass around so that people can ask the questions from their seats.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You mentioned that compared to other ancient Greek authors, we have Homer's actually not the most difficult. And I was wondering if you could say, one, what you think are some of the more difficult ones and what makes Homer more accessible, and if that's something that should be more emphasized when people talk about general readers of classics of the Iliad and the Odyssey?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are different kinds of difficulty in any text. The Homeric poems are syntactically very straightforward, and it's partly because they emerge from this oral tradition and they include these formulaic sort of Lego building blocks of narrative, which are sort of plugged in, which means that they don't have the kind of complex subordinated syntax that you find in, say, Pindar, and they also don't have the sort of dense metaphoricity that you find in, for instance, the choral odes of Aeschylus, where Aeschylus is sort of making up very original new metaphors, and you have to try and follow along with, there have been 5 different metaphors already in this sentence, and 3 different words coined by wedging other words together, and what does it all mean? In Homer, there aren't these sort of new, the terms that are wedged together, like rosy-fingered dawn, are traditional. You can sort of relax that dawn is going to be rosy-fingered. You're not going to have to get your mind around a new metaphor. And you're also not going to have to get your mind around where exactly was the main verb kind of thing. I mean, if you sort of think about English poetry, like the way that in reading Paradise Lost, you may have that sense of, this sentence has been going on a very long time, and I know that there have been several relative clauses, and I don't know when the main verb's going to come up. You never have that with Homer, because it's very often coordinated syntax, where it's, and then this, and then this, and then they held a funeral, and then they burnt the body, and then they gathered up the bones, and then they did it like that, where it's short units with a verb in each. So it has that kind of simplicity, which of course is both a mark of the oral heritage of these poems, and it's also designed for ready comprehension when performed out loud. There are kinds of difficulty that are there in the Homeric poems. I mean, I sort of pointed to the ways there can be psychological and social complexity. I mean, what exactly does this character feel? What exactly is Helen saying about herself? What's going on between Helen and Hector? That's complex. It's not like it's primitive in the sense of being sort of idiotically simple about what are people like, or even what are goddesses and gods like. They're complex, they're layered, they have many sides to them, and you might not always figure it out on even the 100th listen through. But on the syntactical level, it's relatively simple. I mean, there are other kinds of complexity that, or not exactly complexity, but just markedness about Homeric language, because it's a weird language, it's a poetic language that no one actually spoke. So I felt that as a translator, I can't convey that beyond by using a traditional meter, which I felt at least I can do that to convey to an Anglophone reader, it is traditional, even if I'm not going to be able to sort of make up a traditional English that's formed out of multiple dialects, because that's going to sound like this is a fun modernist experiment rather than this is actually traditional. So yeah, I mean, I think the sort of perception of Homer as within our culture, high culture, and therefore must be difficult. That's a particular modern set of assumptions. I mean, in antiquity, the Homeric poems were recognized to be semnos. They're serious, and they have to do with serious themes. They're not obscene. They sort of play with the traditions of obscene blame poetry, as in the Thersites scene in Iliad Book 2, but they're sort of primarily modeled on a different genre. So they're serious, and they have to do with the heroic genre of telling the mythological tales of heroes. But does that necessarily correspond to, and they're difficult to understand what's going on the level of sentence? No. Those are totally different kinds of being sort of high culture in that it's a kind of poetics that invites you to take it seriously, is not the same as that must therefore be incomprehensible. And I think it's interesting that people sort of make those assumptions that if it's important, it must be incomprehensible.
My question is about belief. There are a couple of moments in the Iliad which have made me recently wonder what the audience listening to these stories actually believe. There's the moment when, at the urging of Odysseus, Agamemnon makes this great oath to the gods in the presence of the entire army that he never touched the girl Briseis.
Yeah.
And I've wondered, wow, did people think, well, he just lied? And then there's the moment when Achilles wakes from the dream in which he's seen the spirit of Patroclus, and he says, I think in your rendering he says, so there are shades and spirits down in Hades, which made me think, did he, until that moment, not really think there were? So that's my question.
Those are great questions. I mean, those are much debated questions. And of course, those are questions that were debated throughout antiquity as well. I mean, the question of how the Homeric depiction of gods, which commentators, including Plato, but also including the author of On the Sublime, who sort of says some of the battle scenes that involve gods behaving in undignified ways in Homer, that can't be right, and sort of tries to legislate about, maybe this is an appropriate context to talk about the theology of the Homeric poems, which were seen as debatable in antiquity. The poems themselves were, of course, ultra-canonical, but that doesn't mean that they were treated in the way that the later composed Christian Gospels were, as handed down by the goddesses, even though they invoke the goddesses, but it doesn't have that level of, I stand up and say a creed about believing this. There's a good book by Tim Whitmarsh called Battling the Gods, which sort of traces a history of atheism in antiquity and argues that there was more actual disbelief in the gods than some scholars have suggested. I mean, again, one can disagree with elements of his argument, and one could sort of argue about at what stage and in what text is there evidence for this or that bit of disbelief or total disbelief. I mean, the fact that Agamemnon swears that oath, when haven't actually been told by the narrator anything particular about what has Agamemnon done in the privacy of his own tent, or the relative privacy of his own tent. I mean, it seems to me that what matters is that he says something in public, and in terms of public relations, he just needs to say it. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, and the narrator doesn't get into whether or not it's true, because it doesn't matter from the perspective of the narrative. But your second example is a very different one, about the reality of dreams as divine manifestations, which of course was believed, or at least asserted by almost everybody who comments on it in antiquity, the idea that there are spirits in Hades. But what exactly is meant by that, and what kind of reality does a psyche have when it's flitting around in Hades? Again, that was clearly debated in antiquity, and clearly also people in later periods of antiquity had different views from what seems to be suggested by the Homeric poems. So sort of trying to map Homer onto what might somebody have thought in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, it might not match. Yeah, I didn't really answer that, but good questions.
Hi, thank you very much. If you'll excuse a very specific question, I was fascinated by your emphasis on Helen referring to herself as a dog, and I wonder what, if any, parallels you see to the moment in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes home disguised as a beggar and is recognized by his dog Argus. And that's sort of presented as a moment of loyalty and faithfulness, especially because earlier in the poem, Helen tells a story of Odysseus dressed as a beggar sneaking into Troy to see her. So that just occurred to me while you were speaking, and I thought your emphasis brought that out in a fascinating way, and I wonder if you could comment. Thank you.
Yes, so I completely agree with your implicit reading, which is that, I mean, I was sort of trying to hint at that with talking about Helen's perceptiveness. As you say, that in the story that Helen tells in Book 4 of the Odyssey, she tells about how Odysseus was in disguise in this earlier period during the Trojan War, and she was the only one who saw through his disguise. So she presents herself as somebody who has this capacity to see through disguises, and that she also is able to recognize Telemachus despite having only seen him once as a baby. And you might not think it would be possible to recognize somebody in those circumstances, though presumably she's also recognizing that he looks just like his dad, even though he doesn't feel just like him. So I think the capacity to recognize and to see through human norms and human disguises is doggish. That there's the kind of cleverness that a dog can have of smelling someone out is part of what Helen has, is that ability, like Argos the dog, to recognize, even though he can't listen to Odysseus' false narratives, but he knows what he smells like, and so he knows it's him right away. So I think Helen has that kind of doggishness, that she has the ability to see through all the stuff that we may use to dress up who we are and figure out who is that really. Yeah.
All right, we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to end.
Hi, thank you. Oh.
No idea where this person is.
I'll go. Could you talk a little bit more about maybe the alien aspects of the poems that don't map as much onto our current cultural mores as people would like them to?
Yes, sorry, I can't see where you are, but maybe it doesn't matter. I can hear you. Thank you, great question. Yes, there's so much to say about that. I mean, there are sort of the obvious things, like the foodways are not normal modern foodways, and the presumably weren't actually the foodways of archaic Greece either. People never actually ate those hecatomb-rich meals. The animal sacrifice, as we discussed already, the divine apparatus, the belief in shades in the underworld who aren't identical with the body as the self, and then there's the psyche in the underworld, which I think is a weird concept from a modern perspective. I talked a little bit about using the metaphor of dog rather than trying to translate it into something else, but in general, the ways that experiences are very often presented in the language of the Homeric poems as if things that we might think are immaterial presented as if they were material, like sleep wrapping around you or grief wrapping around you, or emotions swelling up inside you as if they were physical things, which maybe they are, but they're presented in ways that makes them sound very, very material. And then also the way that, I think if we have in our head the kinds of narrative patterns that are normal in 19th or 20th century fiction of either it's going to be a romance kind of thing and it'll end with a marriage or people getting together, or it'll be a Bildungsroman and someone will grow up and figure out who they are and find their place in society. Neither the Iliad or the Odyssey follows those kinds of narrative patterns. They're different kinds of narrative, and they have to do with it. They still have to do with people and societies, as maybe all narratives do, but they're not those particular narratives that we may have so ingrained into our sense of what a story is that it's hard for us to recognize that it can still be a story if it's not about those things.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about the transmission of the text throughout history. And so I kind of have two questions about that. So first, how similar do we think, for instance, the text you were translating from is to the text that someone like Herodotus or Plato would have had access to? And the second question is, can you recommend a starting point for looking into or studying kind of how it's been transmitted throughout history?
So this is the capital H, capital Q Homeric question, which somebody always asks, and it's a wonderful question about which many pints of ink have been spilt over the last century, especially since Milman Parry and Lord's researches in the former Yugoslavia. I personally think that the text that we have is probably pretty similar to the text that Plato read. The text that we have is based on the texts that were compiled and edited by the scholars at the Library of Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE, and we have handed down among the Homeric scholia the comments on that text. We have some notes on these various variations that were known to those scholars in that period. We also have a few quotations of Homer in Plato, and of course references to Homer in Herodotus as well, and in some cases those attest to various textual variations. Some scholars suggest in their account of all this that there were definitely individuatable from our period in history stages in the formation of the text as a written thing, and that it may have been very, very much in flux throughout the classical period of the 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BCE. Greg Nage at Harvard, and everyone who was ever taught by Greg Nage sort of believes that there were these various stages, and that it really was very, very much in flux until the time of the Library of Alexandria. I tend to think that I'm not sure that I'm convinced by the evidence for that. I think there's evidence for minor variation, but I think that the evidence suggests that there was only relatively minor variation. Of the kind like, so for instance, in the first lines of the Iliad, we're told by one of these ancient commentators that the dead bodies of those who were massacred thanks to the menace of Achilles, will become a banquet for the birds, and for either loot for the, I messed it up, sorry. Either eaten by the dogs or by all the birds, or a banquet for the birds. And so there were these two different phrases there. Is it for all the birds, which sounds like the easy reading, and therefore might have been used to explain what does a bird banquet mean? Why are these birds having a human and anthropomorphized sounding banquet? So there's that kind of variety, which I think you would actually expect in any performance text, right? I mean, we have the Bad Quarto of Hamlet, which has far more variations on the text than we actually know of in concrete ways about the Iliad or the Odyssey. There's a huge reading list to go with it if you want to dig in more to all of that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you again. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. On behalf of everyone at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, we want to thank Emily Wilson for tonight and the entire season, the riveting lectures that you gave. You can feel the passion, can't you? Tonight's event is a shining example of the many fascinating programs and experiences that the American School offers on a regular basis as part of our mission. Emily will be having a book signing in the back of the church, so I hope that you'll stop and say hello, congratulate her, and thank her for offering these lectures. We hope that you truly enjoyed tonight and that you do stay connected with us by joining the American Friends of the Ignatius Library. You can do so by scanning the QR code on the back of those bookmarks that were found on your seat. Be the first to hear about upcoming lectures, exhibitions, and concerts. And be sure to take a newsletter on the way out to see all the incredible work being done at the Ignatius Library. But finally, when you find yourselves in Greece, do stop by, visit the Ignatius Library, leave time in your schedule for that. You will not be sorry. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.